Well, I guess we might as well get started then. Numbers are going up. Um, well, everyone, welcome to our panel here called Unpacking the Mysteries of the Academic Talk. And I'm excited to have you all here, our panelists. We have Yolande Bouka from Queen's University, Milli Lake from the London School of Economics and Political Science, Leonardo Arriola from UC Berkeley, and Brendan Kendhammer from Ohio University. And I am Josef Woldense from University of Minnesota. And I'm excited particularly for this panel because I had just finished doing a virtual workshop, and some of you attendees may have actually been at the workshop already. But now I get a chance to hear from other scholars and how they approach this subject matter, which is, I guess, sort of the bread and butter for our discipline in the academy in general. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to draw your attention to there's going to be, well, I can post it, but I'd rather just draw your attention to it, which is a form in case you have an interest to form a working group with others to practice your job talk or your academic talk in general, and you'd like to have feedback from other peers. There will be a form that will be sent out where you can sign up. Just fill up you'll see the information about, well, what your topic is and things of that nature. In fact, it was just posted, the link, if you see under chat. And yeah, sign up and you'll get into groups and hopefully it'll be useful going forward for you. I'll give you another reminder at the end of our talk, but check it out. So the way we'll structure today's panel is I have a couple of questions prepared that the panelists will respond, but there will be a lot of freedom to speak and maybe go in directions that you panelists would like to go into. And that'll be the first 45 minutes. And then the second 45 minutes will be all Q&A. And for the Q&A session, I will draw attention to this again, but you will see a tab on the bottom that says Q&A. And there you will be able to post your questions. Others can upvote it, and then I will read those questions to our panelists. Okay. Okay, so with that said, the first broad question that I have, and that is, and we can sort of walk through or have each one of you answer these questions, and that is, can you walk us through your thought process when you prepare an academic presentation? Right. So that is, here you are, you have a paper, a manuscript of whatever, 12,000 words, and now you're supposed to give this verbal presentation. What is that thought process that you go through as you're translating your research from one mode of communication to another? And whoever feels free to speak first.
Shall I go first? Thanks so much, Joseph. Can everybody hear me fine? It's working. So I guess one of the things I would start by saying is I'm not a confident public speaker. So I still, after nearly 15 years doing this, get super nervous every time I give a talk. So I really have to prepare. Like, I spend a lot of time preparing and practicing again, often even for short APSA presentation style talks. So the first thing, I think the very first thing I do, and echoing, I think, something that Joseph had said in his earlier talk on this, is really try and put the paper out of my head. I really never approach giving a talk as converting the paper into a presentation style version of the paper to the extent that I'm able to avoid it. And I find that's a really hard thing to do, and to kind of try and disassociate those two things from the outset. But so the first thing I do in trying to put the paper out of my head is just really thinking about what is the one idea I want people to walk away from in the audience. If they're going to remember one thing about my talk and about what I'm trying to communicate, what do I want that one thing to be? And normally that's the argument of an academic paper or a job market paper. And so then the second thing I do is try and make sure that the question itself is really clear, and that, as with any paper or piece of work, that the argument or the idea I want to communicate is responding to a question, and then think about how I want to piece those two things together. So then I will walk through the presentation kind of chronologically, but almost backwards from the end. So thinking about what that idea is I want people to walk away with first, and then thinking about how best I'm going to be able to communicate and convey that idea and convince and persuade audience members of that one piece of information or that one argument. And for me, that normally comes through stories, anecdotes, personal anecdotes, visual aids in any kind of talk, actually, and then the evidence and the data that I want to draw from, and how I can kind of communicate that evidence and data in ways that that people will be receptive to, and in ways that kind of reflect the process that I went through to convince myself of that argument, and that made me believe in that story that I've kind of come to. So I would say, yeah, I mean, there's lots more I could say about that, but I'll pass to other panelists. I know there are other questions that we'll talk through, but that's where I start.
Great, thank you.
I guess I can go next. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to participate in this panel. And it was kind of strange because, once you get the job, I guess you become an expert in the talk or presentation, but you know very well that you're not. So it also gave me an opportunity to think a little bit about the process I go through when I present, or the various times where I gave job talks. And I approach my presentations a bit differently from, I think, many people, because I'm very comfortable speaking publicly. I enjoy having an audience. I enjoy communicating my ideas and feeding off of the audience to guide the way I speak, which means that this era of COVID has been remarkably difficult for me because I can't read, it's difficult to read the audience when you can't see them. And I like to think about sharing my data or disseminating my research as an entire process of storytelling. So a little bit like Milli was talking about, she talks about vignettes and stories and anecdotes. For me, the entire presentation is about telling a story about who I am as a scholar. I think it's important to communicate that, but also why the audience should care about my research. I think once I feel like once I hook my audience on the importance and the relevance of my research, they more easily follow through my thought process. I also get very nervous when I draft a text. I'm not a good, I get very nervous when I have to read in public. So I actually go simply with bullet points, and that goes whether I'm talking about an academic presentation at a conference or a job talk. I've never written the text of a job talk because I know that I will fumble my way through. So know yourself, because the formula that you have to write, that you have to memorize, may not work for you. I'm not good at memorizing. What I spend a lot of time on, in addition to identifying, well, how can I hook my audience? In order to know how to hook my audience, I have to know who my audience is. So the way and I think this comes in the next question, but the way I approach an academic conference and the way I approach a class for a guest lecture will definitely be different. And the mechanics, I think, I really loved your handout because it kind of walks you through the mechanics of how to create a job talk or a presentation. But what I think people don't spend enough time on is the pace and the rhythm of how you talk to people who are listening to you. It's a performance. Presenting is a performance. It's an art. And sometimes you have a wonderful argument. You have a wonderful set of data that you want to communicate to the world, but the pace makes it difficult for people to follow what your argument is. So to me, presenting is an art. It requires, notes, music, and rhythm, in addition to all the nice and essential components to a good research question, a good set of data, and a solid paper.
Thank you. Leo or Brendan, either one of you?
I think, well, I'll just go since I had muted myself first. And so I think I'm going to echo a lot of what Milli and Yolande have said already, which is I completely agree that, and this is what I think you did in your last workshop, Joseph, which is you're there to tell one story. And you have one message that you're trying to get across in your 40-minute presentation. And you have to remember that you are, especially if it's a job talk, most folks have not read anything that you've produced. Maybe only the people on the committee have read any of your work. So most people are coming in blank to what your presentation is. And so be very clear with yourself what it is that you're trying to communicate. And a lot of the details they're not going to remember. So you want to be upfront with what the main message is that you want them to walk away with. So that's one thing. The second thing, though, that I would encourage folks to give more thought to, which is their slide deck. And there are a lot of limitations with, the standard, template for how to present, but it also enforces some kind of discipline on you for forcing you to present your information, your theory, and your data in an intuitive and digestible way. And it's unforgivingly linear, right? That's what the slide deck is. It's all linear, but it forces you to condense and cull as much of a lot of what you think is interesting, but you can't fit it all in. You really can't. And I will tell you that one of the mistakes that I feel I often see in job talks is that they overwhelm their audience with details. And sometimes I may be in the middle of a job talk and I no longer know what I'm supposed to be focusing on because there's so many things going on. And that's, I think, what you don't want to do. So there is that challenge. And I think part of what I try to do for myself is, to think about what is essential. If I keep stripping away details, have I gone too far, and will I lose my audience if I don't tell them this bit of information? So that's something I do for myself. The other thing I will say, though, about the linear logic of the presentation, and this is where I might disagree a little bit with other folks, is I do stay close to the paper in terms of the structure, which is there is a certain set of cognitive expectations that I think most job talk audiences have. They expect you to give them a puzzle, tell them what the literature says about this puzzle. What's your theory? Because now that's the value added to the literature that you're bringing. What's your research design? What's your empirics? What are your empirics? And what's your conclusion? It's super linear, and I know it's for some folks that's a bit frustrating, but I think it is an expectation, and any deviation from that creates a cognitive burden for the audience. So that's something to think about, and you don't have to do it that way, but I think it's become a norm, a strong norm, that this is sort of what presentations look like. If you go to APSA, even in 15 minutes, that's kind of what a presentation looks like. So that's something I would say. I would point out also, though, that the slides are a complement, not a substitute for the talk. And this goes back to this point that I'm trying to make, which is don't put too much on there, because the more you put on your slides, the more you're asking me to read your slides rather than pay attention to what you're saying. And so that's something that I encourage folks to give a lot of thought to. The third thing I'll mention, though, is about the audience. And I think Yolande mentioned this too, which is, especially for a job talk, you should give thought to the reputation of a department. And by that, I mean, what are their norms and their practices in a seminar or in a colloquium? Different departments have different cultures. So you should ask your faculty mentor or dissertation chair or other folks you know who might know that department or people who are there, so that you can get a sense of, is this a department where they expect to interrupt in the first 5 minutes? Or will they sit there politely and let you finish before they get to Q&A? That may be, that exists. There are very different norms. And so I would plan ahead and prepare myself accordingly. Also, I would give thought to the composition of the department. Is this a department where it's mostly Americanist? And so I will have to show them on a map where the country I study is, because they won't know anything, right? And so I think Milli mentioned the persuasion aspect of this. How do you persuade that particular type of audience that what you have to bring is important and relevant, not just for what you do, but for political science generally? And so that is a challenge. And so you should think about that given the type of audience you're facing. So I'll stop there.
All right. So I was a little bit, to be entirely honest, confused why I was asked to participate in this, because I'm squarely in the middle of my career and haven't given a job talk of a normal sort in a very long time. But I'm going to assume that I was asked to participate because I give a lot of talks. And in particular, not a lot of talks of the sort that we've been discussing so far, where you've got some discrete piece of research. But I've given something like 60 or 70 talks to policymaking audiences and other kinds of sort of quasi-academic audiences over the last 7 or 8 years, because I work in an area that's policy relevant. And the process for doing that sort of thing is not all that dissimilar from what we've heard, particularly from Yolande and Leo, where thinking about and knowing as much as you can about your audience is really very important. And the differences between those audiences are really sort of, I mean, they can be quite different, but the core thing to understand about them is, where are they starting? Right? Rather, in the talks that I give to sort of quasi-academic audiences, it's less about identifying a puzzle or talking about sort of the crux of your research, but sort of identifying what their priors are. What are the things that they're going to come into this talk assuming about the thing that I've been asked to discuss? And what can I do in 40 minutes or 15 minutes to move them as far off of that thing as I can? And so it's a slightly different way of constructing talks, but it has a lot of similarities to organizing job talks, in the sense that if you're doing innovative research, or research that's maybe a little bit outside of the sort of hypothesis testing framework, which is especially true for those of us who do kind of interpretivist qualitative research, you're not just sort of plugging a hole in the literature and saying, okay, I found this. You're saying, look, people have generally framed this question in this way, or they have thought about this question in this way. And I'm not just going to present you with a finding, but with a reframing. And understanding what framings your audience brings to a talk can be really valuable and important. In some senses, you learn those things over time. Now, the other thing that I'll say is that, as somebody who's not at a research university, a research one university that trains doctoral students, I mean, Leo's point about finding, contacting people and finding out what the norms and expectations of your department would be. If you came to give a job talk at my department, unless you knew me, it would be super unlikely you could get any of that information. And I think that it's true of the bulk of places where a lot of people are going to go out and give job talks. And I gave not a spectacular job talk when I was hired here, because it was impossible to find out information about what people knew and they thought. But as a person who now watches a lot of job talks, well, fewer now because we face the same institutional pressures that everybody else does. But I find that it's especially important to sort of recognize that different institutional levels are going to have different institutional expectations too. The people in my department are smart, they read, they're careful and thoughtful, but certain kinds of sort of debates are not going to be as interesting to them, or certain sorts of structuring the importance of a talk around kind of small methodological things or micro level debates that are happening in generalist journals are not going to be appealing. When I'm in deliberations afterwards, the thing that you don't want to hear is, I didn't think that was very interesting. That's the language. And interesting is almost always code for, did you persuade me, a person who works on something completely unrelated to this, that it would be interesting to teach to my undergraduates, or that I could take away and present it to my master's students in a general seminar on comparative politics. And thinking about how you're going to find a way to include that along with presenting what you need to show that you're a serious researcher who's got a publishable project is, I think, especially important when you're going to departments that are not PhD producing institutions. And so I'll end there. We got a lot more questions.
Great. I'm going to divert just a little bit from the questions I had given you beforehand. Just kind of want to follow up on this underlying theme that you all have brought up, and that is the sort of the central role of the audience in presenting. Oftentimes we sort of think of presenting as, well, I'm offering you, whoever you are, the sort of my gift that is my research, as opposed to in the way that you have all described it as, I'm sort of secondary to my audience. I just so happen to be the conduit, but really it's the audience that matters here. So if you can elaborate on, maybe give us examples. Leah, you already have talked about the idea of, I'm using a map to show you where my research site is. Right? Sort of that's because I've already thought about my audience. But just elaborate a little bit on what you have done concretely to persuade your audience, to meet your audience, and sort of have them engrossed or hook them, as Yolande, as you were saying, in your presentation, your work.
I can actually give you, because some of the memories are quite fresh for me, because I'm a new faculty member, in terms of what I've done to really get to know my audience. When I'm invited to give a presentation, I've given a couple of job talks, and what I've done each time is creating a folder on who's on the committee or who's in the department. And that's a bit tedious. I actually spend a lot more time doing that kind of background reconnaissance work than I do preparing my talk, because I want to be able to see, and that you should kind of do that when you're writing your application. So that file usually exists somewhere, like a draft of that file on my computer before when I'm applying. Who's in the department? What kind of classes do they teach? What kind of publications? Where do they publish? What are they working on? And what I like to do, because I do think it's a game of seduction as well, is figuring out the ways in which there are potential intersections, and it's not always possible, but with some members of the audience, in terms of what is so-and-so researching and publishing on, and can I draw a parallel between what I'm doing and what they're doing. But I do it in a way that's very subtle. I try not to be on the nose, but so that it can awaken a certain level of interest. So I create this file where I go through. Sometimes you do know the committee members. Some universities are very transparent about who the members of the committee are. Other times they're not. And if it's a big department, then it'll be a lot more complicated. So you may need to do some, I'm sorry, there's people screaming in the background. So, you may need to talk to people who may know people in the department, but it's not always the case. When it's possible, and you do have the names of the committee members for a job talk, what are they publishing on? What kind of grants have they been applying to, or what kind of grants have they received, so that I know who I'm speaking to. And then it becomes a lot easier in my presentation to weave in potential connections between the research or the questions. Like my questions are very similar to X question. I'm not giving the faculty member's name, but I'm trying to link to say that if I were to be invited in your department to be a faculty member, even though we're not talking about the very same research question, we have intersections. I can understand the language you're speaking, and I'm trying to translate my work into something that is more comfortable for you to understand. Because I think the challenge sometimes when we do very niche research, I consider myself to do something that is not always interesting to other people, is that we kind of want to say it's important. It's important, and I want you to understand the relevance of my work without trying to meet people halfway. And in a job talk, what is easier to do in a job talk, I think, than in a large audience, is that if you know who you're speaking to, you can have one-on-one conversations as you're giving your presentation to the 5 members of the committee who are actually important in making the decision. So it's background research about who you're speaking to, and that goes to creating a file. Who is Maria Fuentes, and what is she working on? Where did she publish, and so forth.
Great. Others? Again, just however you center the audience and sort of steps that you have taken, things you can remember. Go ahead, Brent.
Yeah, well, so I was going to say, I think Yolande's point is really useful in that when I've given sort of more conventional academic talks, I've often been reminded that if you're trying to publish an article, you have sort of centered or framed that article around kind of whatever level of sort of journal or debate you're trying to get it into. And so you start your story kind of at a certain point where you've identified the gap, right? And when you're beginning a job talk to an eclectic department full of people who do lots of things, or a more general academic audience, you have to remind yourself that there is this level above where you have framed it. That is often implicit in the way that you talk about your research to people doing exactly what you do, but that is not implicit to people who are thinking about this for the first time, right? So when I was, job talking and giving academic talks about my first book project, which was on Islam and democracy in Northern Nigeria, I was starting the debate at this very particular level in that literature where I was presuming sort of the obvious empirical importance. And I had to remember that, no, like you can establish the empirical real world stakes of these things, even if you sometimes feel like in the heat of writing that your research is niche, right, or narrow. It's not narrow. You just have to remember the framing of it. Like, no, I'm talking about a place with, more Muslims than the entire Arab Peninsula together, or Arabian Peninsula together. And I'm talking about a place where there's a lot of political violence. And here I'm trying to sort of tease out the implications of these things. You're setting an empirical kind of sense of importance and not just a theoretical or literature sense of importance. And I found that that's a really effective way of grabbing people. You're establishing stakes in the same way that someone working on American politics, about voter ID. There are ways to present that have a more general resonance and that demonstrate the importance to people who are observing, because smart people who follow the news, than there are other ways. And so that's been something that's been helpful to me.
Can I jump in on that? Not directly on that point, but on this question of audience, because I 100% agree with everything that Yolande and Brandon have said. And I think convincing the audience that you're speaking to of why your topic is important is one of the most crucial things that you can do in any talk. And I would walk myself back to what made me think my topic was important and what convinced me that this was a really important thing to study. Like, kind of take yourself back to when you were first kind of searching for your research project, and think about that more for myself and my process. That's what that's the mindset I try and put myself in, more so I think than maybe what Yolande was saying about trying to kind of really identify who the people are you're speaking to. And it's not that I don't think that's important, certainly, and whenever you go to a job talk, you should have that folder, and I went through that exact same process. But I guess one of the things I would maybe just add to that is you don't necessarily know as the candidate who the important people in the room are, and it might not be the people on the committee. Even if you have that information, there can be a super harsh critic or a swing voter or anybody in that faculty meeting, and you have really very little access to that information as a job candidate unless you have a really good inside scoop. So I guess I would just kind of emphasize that you want to keep the talk on your terms and on your turf, and while you want to know who you're speaking to and engage in this process of how can you show people from very diverse kind of intellectual and epistemological backgrounds that what you're saying is important and should matter to them, I would urge against trying to do that kind of, or trying to second guess too much who those people are and therefore what is going to convince them, and kind of take a step back and be a bit more general about that process, because you're not always gonna guess that correctly, so it can be a bit of a fine line to walk, I think. Yeah.
So I'll just add two notes to what everyone else has said, and I second what's been said so far. So two things that I think candidates should keep in mind. One is you've applied for a very specific position. And so in some departments, it's the call is specific. We want somebody who's going to teach this. So remind yourself that part of your presentation is to persuade your audience, yes, this way you've described, I'm that person, this is me, right? So that's one thing to keep center stage as you're preparing. Of course, part of the challenge in some, including my department, is sometimes now we have open calls. So it's kind of a best athlete model. And so there's a lot more uncertainty. And so that makes it even more difficult. But the second thing, again, going back to the culture or the type of department that you're applying to or where you're giving your talk is, and this is not so much about individuals, but for instance, some departments are more concerned with causal inference than others. And if that's the case, then, and part of your job is if part of the task is to persuade them that you're one of them, right? If that's what they're looking for, then, is there something in your project that you can deploy to show them, oh, see, if this is what you guys emphasize or care about, let me show you that this is what I can do too. Because again, the presentation is about choices. For me, it's always a painful process because I end up cutting a lot of things that I think are interesting and that I want to talk about, but I don't have time to talk about. And so in that set of choices, sometimes you can bring out things that could be useful to you with a particular type of department, and other things that might not do as much for you. And so, I'm not saying have a very different talk for every single department, but there is some tailoring, some degree of tailoring that you can do and can be helpful for you on the margin. And so that's how I would think about it.
Actually, you mentioned something that I do want to follow up on, which is cutting stuff out, right? So, cutting or not including in your presentation. So how do you choose? Right? You have a piece of information from your research in general, and you now have to make a decision on whether to incorporate it in your presentation or not, right? And so here we're talking about all of these different things, right? Like an audience may want you to speak about causal inference, or they may want you this or that, or whatever it may be. And so you're mentioning time as a constraint. I just don't have time to talk about it. Let's assume you have an hour and a half, maybe even 2. Even then, would you cut things out? And if so, what is your process to come to that conclusion and say, I'm sorry, but this piece of information of my research will not make it into my presentation? What would that be?
You're killing me, Joseph. This is a very hard question, but I think what I would say up front is, I always think, this is an exaggeration. 75% of what's in a dissertation or a paper is not essential for telling the story that you need to tell, right? It's secondary tests, or it's, or interesting details, but it's not essential, right? For the theory to hold, the theory is going to have its own internal logic, and you have to present that. And if you can do that in a bare bones way, that's great. And if you have time to add to it, fantastic. Similarly with the empirics, and the research design, you need to be able to explain what is the minimum the audience needs to know in order to get to the end of this story with me, right? And that sounds horribly abstract. And I think part of it is because every project is somewhat different, and what is essential to tell the story of a project or a research question is slightly different. So I don't have like a super satisfying answer to this question. I would say though that a lot of what folks often think is essential sometimes isn't. And what I would do in that case is I would make Q&A my friend, right? So you said an hour and a half. I wish I had an hour and a half. I mean, you don't though, right? You're gonna have 40 minutes probably for yourself to tell what you need to tell. And the things that I would cut out, I often put in my appendix, at the end of my slide deck. And I say, if somebody asks me anything that is even tangentially related to this slide, I'm gonna bring up this slide because I wanna show the audience that I'm so clever, I thought about this, And that's what those backup slides are for. right? And so, you know, and I think that's a good thing to do. You know, a lot of the robustness tests and other things that folks are expected to do, those can go into the backup slides because somebody will ask you some kind of follow-up question. And so anticipate that, plan for it, think ahead of the kinds of questions you're gonna provoke, and know that you can then use this information that you're cutting from the main presentation and bring it back into Q&A. So that's one piece of advice I would give.
I guess one thing I would just add to that is to kind of go back to what we were saying right at the beginning about this, what is this one idea that you want to communicate to your audience and you want them to walk away with, especially in a job talk, but also in a conference, you know, at APSA or wherever, where people are maybe watching 3-4 talks. If you're at a conference, they're watching maybe, you know, 20, they're very saturated with information. So I would always walk it back to this fundamental kind of question of how am I going to get this fundamental idea to stick in their head? How am I going to get this one core idea to stick in people's heads so that when they're talking, I mean, this is particularly, I know we'll talk about the difference between job talks and other academic talks a bit later, but particularly in a job talk, I think when they come to the faculty meeting, which may be in like 3 weeks time, because you know, candidates may fly out at different times, what are they going to remember about you? And so I would think, when I think about cutting information out, I mean, and this is to go back to what we were saying before, and Leo, I think you mentioned that you do kind of follow a bit the structure of an academic paper, but this is where I would really throw everything out and choose selectively what do I want to put in rather than what I want to pull out of the paper. So what do I want to put in this presentation that will help kind of service these two goals: convincing having the audience remember my argument and convincing them of why that argument matters and why I believe in it, why this is the idea I'm kind of conveying to you today. So yeah, I mean, I would say, rather than thinking about cutting details or like leaving things out of the presentation, really think about what you need to put in to kind of bring the audience on that journey with you. And the other thing I guess I just will add to that is, I think when I've watched people practice job talks, like especially in the first or second practice, the one thing I think almost universally I observe is people thinking that they're repeating their argument a lot of times, and actually it really just not being clear what that argument is. And so no matter how many times you think that you're being repetitive, I would say it's probably not enough, and you need to really feel like it's overkill if the audience who is seeing it for the first time is going to get to that place that you are at, where they feel, oh, okay, stop repeating yourself, stop saying the same thing over and over again. It takes a long time for an audience to get to that place, and it takes a very short amount of time for you to get to that place. So do keep repeating the core ideas and coming back to them, even if for you it feels like it's overkill. It almost never is, in my experience. So.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, man, job talks are the most artificial, most difficult sort of academic or, you know, quasi-academic talk you're ever going to give. And all of these decisions are magnified 15,000 times. And I mean, to sort of Milli's point, I give a really good talk now about conflict dynamics in Northeastern Nigeria because I've done it literally 30 times, right? Nobody is going to give a job talk about a particular subject that many times. You never have the chance to really develop all of the anecdotes and the stories and to really nail it and to be prepared for everything that might come up in Q&A and to get to deploy all of these strategies. There is a certain amount of like inherent chance and stochasticity in job talks that you can't control everything. And so figuring out what the best of your story is, right? Like in those kinds of academic talks, have really honed in on 1 or 2 anecdotes because I do this kind of descriptive qualitative research. Whether or not I think that's the most central to my theory, because I can tell them really powerfully and hook them and adapt them, as Yolande sort of talked about, to lots of different kinds of audiences or people who are interested in lots of different things. They have what it seems now to be obvious, a universal resonance. And that there's never going to be the perfect way to do any of this. I've seen job talks go great, and I've seen job talks be derailed by seriously goofy things that no amount of preparation and having a folder could have possibly prepared for. And in some sense, I mean, not preparing. The preparing is important. The getting to know the department is important. But giving up the idea that you can control everything and telling the best story that you have is, I think, at a lot of departments, your best strategy.
I like that last point because you actually have to be ready for anything. And I think over preparing for your talk, just like over preparing for a lecture, then doesn't allow you the flexibility to then rebound from somebody derailing your talk or your presentation and then continuing or adapting the way you're approaching an argument. So and that doesn't necessarily answer the question per se, but I think that's really, really important. As we're talking about preparing, you know, this is one of the reasons why, for me, memorizing an entire text is problematic, because then if I lose my train of thought, I don't know where to pick back up because I can't remember. But I think I like Milli's idea of not necessarily throwing anything out, but figuring out what you're going to put in. And when you do policy training or media training, they kind of tell you, you know, you want your audience to remember your 2 or 3 main takeaways. And I think the challenge sometimes when we do a job talk, or even when you're presenting a paper, is the idea that you have to include every single argument in said dissertation or said paper. I pick 1 or 2. Like if I'm presenting a book project, I don't have to present the whole book project. At least that's my approach, yeah? I'll pick a chapter and I'll focus on that particular chapter and then explain how it fits into a larger argument. Because I think for me, the type of work that I do, the texture of the work that I do is actually quite interesting for, you know, a general audience, and focusing and zooming in on a specific chapter is more useful to trying to say, my whole book talks about this and this is how I do it. So there are different ways to approach it. I've given job talks where I've focused on a very specific part of a book project, and I've given 2 other job talks that were very successful by talking about 3 distinct projects and discussing a trajectory of my research, the arc of my research as a scholar. You can do that. You can talk as small as a chapter and as big as 3 different projects, but ultimately you have to be able to say with a certain degree of confidence, these are the main takeaways, and I'm not taking anything out. I'm simply I'm using my talk as a canvas, and I'm deliberate about deciding what I'm including, answering the question or the framework that Leo has given us about what people expect that you're going to include in your job talk. So it still has to resonate in terms of the structure, so that people have the question, what was your method on this? Or, you know, what was your theoretical framework on that? They have to be able to recognize that. But you have to be deliberate about what you're including in order to maintain the flow and the clarity that you're trying to convey to the people who are listening to you.
And I would just add to that, because that was really great. The job talk is one of the only times as an academic where you're ever going to be asked to give a very specific talk most of the time to a generalist audience. In virtually the entire rest of your academic life, if you're giving talks, you're either invited because they really want to hear about some specific thing that they're already primed to be interested in, or especially in the policy stuff that I do, they're like, we're going to invite 3 people and you guys are going to coordinate what you're going to cover in advance. And we picked one person who sort of makes this argument and one who sort of makes this argument. And you have much more of an ability to tailor and to have there be an understanding between you and the audience about what it is that you're going to do. Job talks are artificially difficult in this very particular way. And I really like the strategy that Yolande is talking about. So, well, look, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to tell the story that I think is good, no matter what, because there really is only so much control you can have over this goofy construct. I think that that's a really nice way of thinking about it.
One thing I would add is, I think oftentimes we sort of make the mistake, like if I was to ask you, so here's, on the one hand, you have your paper, on the other, you have your presentation. And I ask, well, what's the probability that something in your paper makes its way to the presentation? Well, it's generally just a simple function. How much time did I spend on that piece of information? Right? If I spend 3-4 months on collecting that data or finding that piece of data, or if it took me, whatever, 4 months to do that analysis, then you best believe I'm going to put it in my presentation. Right? That oftentimes sort of implicitly becomes our measure on whether we should or should not include something in a presentation. And I think there, I would very much caution you. In fact, I would very much dissuade you from doing that. Right? Sometimes the thing that you spend the most time on actually does not make it into the presentation and should not make it into the presentation, precisely because it actually adds very little to the story that you're trying to tell. Right? And it hurts. It will hurt if you have to go through that, right? Because there's a lot of sweat and tears that have gone into that piece of information that's in your paper, whether it, let's say, be a robustness test or whatever it may be, the specific interviews that you may have done. Right? But ultimately, when you sort of sit back and sort of look at it from the perspective of the audience and ask, well, what is this adding to my story? And if your answer is, I don't know, I just spent a lot of time on it, then most likely it doesn't belong in the presentation. Right? So that would be the thing that I would add here. We are getting to the Q&A session now. There are a couple more questions, but I think in some ways we have already touched on the questions, the remaining questions that I had. So what I will do is I'll read some of the questions in the Q&A, and if we have some time, I'll come back to the questions that I had listed. Okay. So the first question is by Togan, and I do apologize to the audience if I butcher your name, and I'm pretty sure I am. But nonetheless, here's the question. So it says, if presenting is a performance in a form of art where you have notes, music, and rhythm, how do you excel at that? How do you excel at that? Any tips other than practice, practice, practice? I think I'd particularly appreciate specific resources if possible.
Well, I'll respond to that. It's really difficult because on one hand, you have different levels of comfort with having to perform, and that is something that is part of one's personality. And on the other hand, I actually have zero resources that I could give someone, like this is what you should read, or this is the YouTube video you should watch, or this is the seminar you should follow. I think one of the key points is to be very honest, to be brutally honest about what are your strengths and weaknesses as a presenter. And if you can, it's not just a question of practicing. Like people will practice alone in front of a mirror and then they'll repeat the thing over and over again. But practicing in front of a candid audience, it doesn't have to be a room full of colleagues. It can be a partner. It can be a friend. People who tell you when you speak, you move your hands too much. I mean, it's okay to move with your hands, but sometimes your hands become a distraction. Yeah. When you speak, you say too much, and it breaks the flow of the conversation, of the argument. You need to have people, at least to me, if I approach this particular presentation as a performance, and it's very narrow part of the whole academic talk, you want to have people around you, not necessarily your advisor or your colleagues, people who could tell you about how the flow of your presentation breaks, and then work on that. Once you have, if you're honest also about the strengths and weaknesses, tackle the things that you think are manageable for you. There's no need to say, I'm looking at this person talking, I want to speak like this person, and this is the model I'm going to emulate. I think that's a mistake because it's not going to be natural. Focus on what you can work. I'm sorry I don't have more specifics. I mean, I would like to tell you how I do rhythm and how I speak. I think I always have like small timer that doesn't make a noise when I speak about how much time I want to speak about each section. And that requires coordination and the ability to speak, look at your notes, look at the time, and naturally flow from one argument to another. And unfortunately, it comes with practice, but not practice in your bathroom by yourself. Practice with other people, volunteering to speak when it's uncomfortable. And to be absolutely candid, I've been doing public speaking since I was a child. So that also helps. but simply means I have my partner who is not as skilled in public speaking, and I've told him, join Toastmasters. It sounds a bit, pedestrian in terms of an advice, but the ability to be in an accepting group of people who will tell you, yeah, the way you move side to side, the way you fidget with your pen, the way you say or you don't finish your sentences when you speak. These are the kind of things that an advisor may not be paying attention to, but that a friend that you say, I need you to tell me why how I speak is not conveying my arguments, may be helpful. And that's the mechanic of speaking in public. Sorry.
I'm going to jump in on this because I am really, Yolande is an outstanding public speaker. I've seen her give talks a few times and she's really, really excellent at it. And I think it's I mean, I empathize with all of the PhD candidates who feel like they are not good at the talk, because that's exactly how I feel almost all the time I present. And yet I do give good talks, I think, I hope. I think I give good job talks at least.
You do.
But for me, it really is practice. And I want to second what Yolande said about practicing with an audience. From my personal experience, before I even get to that point, I have to be really confident in what I'm saying. The first time I go through a talk, it's so bad. And normally for me, the first 5 to 10 times I go through my talk, it's really bad. I'm just not words don't come to me intuitively when I'm speaking to an audience in the way that I wish they would, in the way that I feel like they do when I write. And so I need to kind of get that rhythm down for myself before I present to anybody else. And I want to also kind of come back on what Yolande said about timing. The worst thing you can do in any talk is to go over time. You do not want to be the person who everybody is thinking, why is this person still talking? It's lunchtime, or why have they been going on the same point for this long? You never want to be that person. So make sure your timing is really on point. And yeah, just in terms of practical tips, I also don't read. I have the same as Yolande. If I was to lose my place when I'm reading from a script, then it would completely fluster me and I wouldn't know where to go. So I really have to make sure I'm really confident in what I'm saying, but also if I'm derailed, I have some kind of aid. And I do it just from slides. I don't use notes because notes make me nervous, because I worry if I lose my notes or drop my notes. So I just use the slides. Have a plan for if the slides stop working as well. So have your PowerPoint on your phone or your laptop so you can go to that. And just give it as many times as you can possibly bear to. This is for the job talk. I wouldn't put this much effort necessarily into just an APCG presentation. That might be overkill. I was going to say one more thing. What Yolande, just coming back to what Yolande said about knowing yourself as well. Really, this is why this kind of advice I think is difficult to give, because it's really different for every speaker. So trust yourself and what works well for you. If you know that you do well with certain types of kind of visual aids or reminders or timekeeping or rhetorical styles, then lean into that and don't necessarily try to mimic what other people do well, because I think that kind of authenticity and confidence, sadly, is really what ends up persuading and convincing people and bringing them with you. And so you have to find a way that you can give a talk that you feel really confident in and that's not mimicking somebody else, if that makes sense.
So I'm always surprised that this rarely gets brought up, I feel like, when we talk about these things, but I like public speaking and I think I do it well, but I got good at it when I started public speaking to undergraduates for a living, right? Teaching large rooms of undergraduates has done more for my ability to be an effective presenter than literally anything else that I've ever done before. Because I give 50-minute lectures 4 times a week to audiences of people who are partially paying attention and zoning in, who are humans, right? Like in all of the ways that you want like a random audience that is going to be good and bad, that's what a room full of sophomores is. And I have learned a lot about what I'm good at as a presenter, the things that Yolande talked about, like my quirks and mannerisms and things that, like, from watching the responses of 19-year-olds. And I feel like that's an under-tapped resource for a lot of graduate students who are teaching actively, right? But aren't necessarily thinking about how can I make use of this experience to be an effective kind of general purpose public speaker. I think that that's a real resource. If you can have people come observe your classes, I mean, not all of the kinds of things that you're doing in a classroom are going to immediately translate to this. More the lecturing part than some of the other part. Lecturing is not the only or best pedagogical method we could use, but if you're going to do it, you might as well learn something, you know, in terms of what you're good at and what you're not. Thinking about, like, I learned a lot about making slides for academic talks from making slides for 19-year-olds, right? Like, because the same basic rules apply. The things that are going to cause people to get confused and zoned out in a job talk room are the same things that cause people to zone out and get confused when you're presenting to them in a big lecture hall. I think if you can get people to see your teaching, if you can get real constructive feedback on your teaching and your lecturing, those are all things that can feed back into this process.
So I'll jump in here, and there are 3 things that I think people should think about about controlling their time. And this may echo some of what others have said, but I also have one that I think is very specific. So the first, I think Yolande put it best about knowing your tempo, knowing your pacing within your presentation. I saw once a presentation where someone spent a good 10 minutes just on the first slide, because they got wrapped up in their head about the motivating vignette that they wanted to use, and the clock is ticking, and that meant that they really didn't at some point they had to sort of rush through other slides, obviously, because they didn't think about how they were wasting time unnecessarily at the beginning. So that's super important. Know how to think about your entire presentation and how much time you're going to spend on each slide. So that's one. Another sort of basic mistake I sometimes see folks make is don't allocate too much time to other people's work. This is your time. You're there to present your original research. And I have seen people sometimes use 2 to 3 slides on just a literature review. And this is not an intro to comparative politics. It's not, you know, you can do 1 slide with saying, here are some of the hypotheses we know exist from the literature. And you acknowledge that so that people know that you know what you're talking about, and then you move on to your work. But I have seen way too many people allocate too much time to others' work. So think about that. But the third thing, and this is going to be more true in some departments than others, is don't let others filibuster. And by that I mean is sometimes in some departments where the norm is to interrupt during the presentation, someone will start asking a question, you'll answer it, they're not satisfied, so they want to keep coming back. But your clock is ticking, and every minute you give to this person is a minute you don't have to finish your presentation. And sometimes, you know, people, they're doing it out of genuine interest. Sometimes people have bad home training, whatever it is. Your time, it's your time, you should control it. And I think you can politely say, maybe after a second go around, you say, you know, let me get through some of the next slides. And if I haven't convinced you by then, let's make sure to come back to this in Q&A, right? But you have to control your time. I have seen way too many job talks derailed by this thing, which is somebody in the audience gets a bee in their bonnet and they really want to hammer at something. But you know what? This is your presentation, your one chance, so you better control it. So that's something that I think folks really need to get comfortable with, is pushing back and just politely saying, we'll come back to this. And believe me, the audience will thank you for it. Something that has not come up, but people should think hard about, is that at least for the next year, many people will be giving job talks on Zoom. And giving a presentation on Zoom as we are now is, I think, a very different thing than doing it live in person. They can't see your body language really. You know, actually right now I'm standing, and I'm standing because I'm more comfortable speaking. I know myself, I prefer to stand when I'm speaking. And so I consciously thought oh, if I'm going to be doing this thing, I better wake up since it's early for me. So I'm going to stand. But you need to think about what space are you going to be in? What time zone are you going to be in? And you should plan accordingly. If you're a graduate student and you don't think you have a quiet enough space, I would contact your department, even though some universities might be mostly shut down or partially shut down. You should tell them, I'm going to give an important job presentation. I need access to a space or an office. Let me back on campus for a one-time emergency. And I think a lot of institutions will accommodate those requests. So that's the kind of thing that folks should be planning ahead for. So I'll stop there.
Great. One thing I would add, and I sort of talk about this in the workshop a little bit, but one thing you may want to consider is sort of almost analyze yourself when you're talking to your friend and you're telling a story. And sort of the example that I give is, think back to your former self, right? When you were a little child. Like, how do children tell stories? It's oftentimes something along the lines of, I did this, and then he did that, and then that, and then this, and then this, and then, right, within 10 seconds, you don't know what's going on. And then imagine now, you once were that person. And now compare it to where you are now. And in many respects, you went through the socialization, this sort of apprenticeship called society, and you've got chances to practice storytelling. You've had chances to hone your technique on how exactly you convey certain kinds of information. And it's become so intuitive to you that you don't even recognize it. And one thing you can try to do is to just sort of try to pay attention. Even if your friend is telling a story, when you're telling a story, pay attention to the techniques that we're employing. It's very intuitive, but it's very refined. And you know that, again, if you compare it to a little child, you'll see just how far you've come, right? And the point being is those same underlying principles of storytelling when you're telling stories that apply in academic setting as well. Obviously, you have to, do it in the right way. But I think in terms of things other than practice, or sort of pointing to a direct resource, I'd say you yourself and your friends are actually a great resource once you start sort of sitting back and pay attention to everything from the vocal energy to the way we stop, the way we frame, the way we carefully make sure that our audience is hooked in when we tell a story, a story. And oftentimes, really, right, like great presenters, when you listen to them, it doesn't feel like you listen to a quote-unquote academic presentation. It literally feels like they're just telling you a story. And that's because they are able to use those same techniques in the context of an academic presentation. That would be.
I'd like to add, I think you kind of put your finger on something important, is the importance of listening to other people speak. And in an academic setting, go to job talks. Go to other people's job talks, go to other people practice job talks. I know that some people have never seen a job talk until it's their time to give one. So go to job talks in your department and go to your colleagues' job talk. First, because it's the right thing to do as an academic, but also because you can learn. You can see the very things that Josef just talked about. What is what is the nature, how do people stop, how do they pause, how do they create momentum as they're giving the information. And having that experience of listening also allows you to kind of frame the way in which you want to share your information.
So I'll move to the next question, and this is about methods and how to convey it to certain kinds of audiences. So the question being, my field work involves a lot of ethnographic methods, ordinary language interviews, archival work, etc. What advice would you give to someone presenting at a department or conference with a lot of Americanists / positivists in the audience? So beyond just sort of pointing at a map, what other techniques are available, or what can one do to speak to that different kind of audience when you do ethnographic research?
I did this. And the second question in the queue, which asks the same basic thing about doing interdisciplinary work and presenting it in a discipline-specific department, I mean, they're basically the same question in this sense, right? How do I present work that I perceive to be sort of different than what most of the people in my audience do in a way that's going to resonate and connect with them? And there is no, I think, entirely correct answer to this other than to remember that they invited you. And like, I've been on the other side of this now. We've never accidentally invited somebody who did a method that we didn't know that they did, right? Like, well, we thought we were getting a positivist and look at this ethnographer, like that doesn't happen. And so you have the baseline assumption of their openness to what you're doing, or else you wouldn't have been invited in the first place. Now that'll only get you so far, but I think sort of recognizing that, you know, you're the specialist and you're the expert, and you're going to present this as being an important and valid way of doing research, self-evidently, because this is what other people in the field do, and you're following established norms and practices. And I've seen this because I'm in a very qualitatively oriented department. The other way, when people come in and do sophisticated quantitative empirical techniques and they have to explain them to a bunch of people like me, and not watching them squirm a little bit, but like, okay, how do I justify this in 45 seconds that I'm following established norms and basic standards in my field? And it's not anything other than that. Like, I'm doing a normal thing. This is how the literature handles these things. I'm also trying to be innovative and maybe do some different stuff, but to be just confident that what you're doing, it fits with the norms and expectations in your part of the academic community, and to not belabor that, I think, but to be prepared to talk about it in more detail if questions come up. And to be confident to assert, I'm going to give my job talk my way, I think is a really helpful way of thinking about those things.
To jump in on that, I would say, yeah, I think seconding what Brandon just said, in a way, you're at an advantage in that situation compared to the other way around. I feel like it's much easier to convince non-experts with stories and rich field work and having anecdotes that you're able to draw from and real people in your stories than it can be to convince an audience of non-statisticians that you're or non-experts in the particular sophisticated quantitative method that you're using, that what you did is effective in kind of layperson's terms. So I would never feel unconfident about that. Be confident in what you did, and then kind of further to that, and this is advice I feel like I give everybody all the time in political science, which is just like, you don't want to put arguments in the world that you don't really believe in. You don't, of course you can be wrong and you can kind of change the way that you think over time and your learning process evolves. But at the time you're putting something into the world, you better believe that that's like a worthwhile thing to be adding to a conversation. And you went through a process of convincing yourself in your argument and in your story and in what you're putting out there. And I think that can get lost oftentimes in the way that we think about like the kind of the very formulaic or like mechanistic approaches to what we do, like framing our work in the literature and like speaking to, you know, kind of justifying our methodologies and ensuring that our work is kind of empirically rigorous and theoretically compelling, et cetera, but like at the very base of it, you are putting a story into the world, an answer to a question or an argument that you have confidence in. And if you do not have confidence in that, what you're putting out there, you shouldn't be putting it into the world, is my opinion. And so how did you get to that space? Like, how did you get to that place where you really believe that this is something worthwhile? And I think that is method, and that is a process of kind of telling people how you eliminated alternative hypotheses and how you kind of, and in some ways, all of us go through this process, whether we're positivists or not. We're all kind of adjudicating between different possible versions of the story that we're putting out there. And so I think just, yeah, I don't know, maybe that sounds really vague, but just kind of walking us through how you are so convinced that what you're putting out there is right, and being confident in how you got there will make other people confident in your story as well.
I want to second, both these comments. And ultimately, there's two things I'd like to say about this. Is first, that's the type of work I do as well, so I definitely know the feeling. Second, when it comes to a job talk, I think it's a little bit different than a conference because depending on where you, like, first, I would not apply to a department where I feel like I wouldn't be a good fit. And I think that comes with risks, opportunities and risk, balancing things out. When I have applied to places where there was a heavy leaning on this type of positivist work, I knew I wasn't going to get called back, and I didn't. Um, and in places where you do have a mix of both qualitative and quantitative scholars, there seems to be, not always, because we've heard some stories, like kind of ability of people to cohabitate with one another within the same department. So if you go back to this kind of formula that we all go through when we are developing our project, ultimately, I think what Leo said about the structure of the talk, be comfortable with your theoretical framework, be comfortable with your methodology, be comfortable talking about alternative hypotheses that you decided to throw out, and then just show your work. There's no need, or it's not useful, in my opinion, to try to adapt the talk to look more quantitative than it is. Like, that's not going to work. So you have to believe, as Milli said, you have to believe in your argument and the data and the work that you've put into it. Maintain the formula that is easily recognizable, whether you're in quantitative or qualitative, and then present your work. But at the same time, I mean, the likelihood of being invited into a highly positivist department to give a talk when that's the type of work you do is also something that should make you a little bit more comfortable or maybe less stressed about it, because you're not always, it's very unlikely that you're going to be invited to talk in a hostile environment with regards to oh, I'm a positivist and I'm looking at this person who's doing ethnographic research and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have somebody who's going to try to take you down in a job talk. I've seen it happen. I think it's absolutely disgraceful. But know the formula, know your work, believe in your work, and present it as is. There's no use to try to adapt to speak more to an approach that you haven't used for your research.
So I will second everything that has been said. This is always the helpful thing about being last is that everybody has said the good stuff, so you could just say, yeah, that was good. But I, especially on the last 2 points that Yolande just made, which others have made too, which is present yourself. I mean, that's what you're advertising. So, and you're trying to find a good match, right? Not just for the department, but for yourself. And present your work as is and in the best way possible. So be true to yourself, and that's the best way possible. So I completely agree with that. The one thing though I will say, and this is slightly different, but it's connected, and Yolande just touched on it, which is sometimes people behave badly during a job talk process and interview, and it's not your responsibility in the moment to police other people's behavior. I think you should make note of it. You might want to tell your advisor about it, and then think about a response after the fact. But in the moment, don't let it derail you. Don't let it overwhelm you, because that happens everywhere. I'm not saying ignore it, because there are things that should not be happening and that tend to be happening to certain types of people. They tend to happen to women candidates. They tend to happen to minority candidates, right? And people will even ask things that are illegal, right? And not necessarily in the job talk itself, but like on the one-on-one interviews. Nobody should be asking you if you are married. Nobody should be asking you about how many children you have. Those are, at least in the United States, those are questions that you're not supposed to be able to ask during an interview. And yet it happens. And it happens just, for lots of different reasons, sometimes benign or innocent reasons. Yet, nevertheless, and I think in the moment, you're there to present yourself, to present your work. Focus on that. Afterwards, when you come back home, when you're debriefing with your advisor and your committee, you can talk about how to respond to the other things that may have happened if you need to, right? So I do want to encourage in solidarity, candidates to just, focus on yourself and let everything else, everything else is a sideshow. You're the main event. So, and again, I'm not saying that to ignore other things. It's just that I think folks sometimes can get distracted, and I don't want you to get distracted, right? Because it takes away from what you're trying to do, which is to present your best self. So I'll stop there.
And you know whose job it is to fix those things is us as colleagues in departments where people do that stuff. And so hopefully you all out there who are watching this are going to get jobs and you're going to be colleagues. You have a responsibility to not let your colleagues do this kind of stuff. And so it's not the jobs market candidates' responsibility. It's our collective responsibility.
One thing I would add to that question of how to present to an audience that is sort of distant from whatever method that you use, I sort of like to think of it almost like when you watch movies. Right? Oftentimes you have the protagonist who there's some kind of problem, and then they come up with some kind of method, whatever it may be, like a particular sword that they have to find, or a particular person they must speak to, or a particular car that they have to use, or whatever that thing is. And that in essence is, right, sort of the method that is being used to solve whatever problem that is being presented. And so one way of thinking about sort of confronting or sort of having an audience that is positivist when you do ethnographic research, think of it not so much that you're justifying your method, but more so think of it in terms of, well, have you painted the problem sufficiently so that it becomes almost obvious that your method is appropriate, that it's helping us get at what we're trying to get at. And I'm bringing up movies because movies do this all the time. By the time you encounter that sword or that car or that person, you as the audience member clearly have bought in and say, yes, that thing that was just used or whatever that method is the solution to our problem. That's the method that we want to use. All right? And so one way you can try to go about it with everything that has been said, stay true to yourself. Don't be a quantitative person when you're not, but still lay out the problem so that it's clear that whatever method you're using is like, yes, absolutely, that is getting us closer to the answer that we want in order to deal with the problem we have. Okay, I will skip the next question because it's very close to the one we just answered, but interdisciplinary audience. So I will go to Janet Box Steffensmeyer. I'm sorry. I actually do know who you are. So the question is, what is the orientation needed to switch to an audience of policymakers? I would like to reach that audience, but only have experience with an academic audience. So how do you switch from an academic audience to a policy audience?
Brendan, isn't this question for you?
I mean, I know you all have also done this stuff, right? Because I've met any number of you at these same events, right? So I know that I'm not the only one who has anything to say about this. First, I actually want to say this is a thrill for me, Janet. I'm also a graduate of Coe College. I think there are like 3 of us in the entire discipline of political science. So it's a pleasure to meet you electronically. I got into this by dumb luck, right? I got into doing policy stuff because there weren't very many Americans who were doing research in Northern Nigeria in the late 2000s. But the specific of it, I think, is, again, learning a lot about what that audience's expectations are and what they care about. And so this idea of, I want to know what the kind of prior expectations or the ways that these problems have been framed in agencies or in particular kind of epistemic communities in government. And I want to see how the research that's happening in my field, my research specifically, but also kind of the scholarly consensus in my community, how I can use that to push at or advance a different way of thinking about and approaching questions. And so a lot of what I do now is essentially, I go to these meetings in government about crises that are happening in the Sahel or in the Lake Chad Basin. And I represent a particular camp now because I'm sort of a known quantity, and I'm there to, this is how I think that these problems have been approached, and this is how I think that they should be approached. And this is the information that I have that maybe you don't have, but you also have a lot of information that I have because you're the government. And here's the theory that I have. Here's the way that I've come to approach or think about these questions that maybe you don't have. And this is why I'm arriving at different conclusions than you are. And I found that to be the most powerful and interesting and enjoyable part of my academic career.
I think, excuse me, I also think it depends on the type of policy audience you're engaging with. You know, I've sorry, if you work with, good Lord. Okay, that's better. If you work with the US government, it'll depend on whether you're talking with DOD or if you're talking with USAID. The priorities of the agencies, as Brendan mentioned, will vary. And what they value most in terms of presentations will also vary. And unfortunately, unless you kind of start getting your feet wet into that particular field, you're not really going to know what those priorities are until you engage with them. You know, even the way in which you speak, the protocol involved. You know, I've spoken to DOD, then I've spoken to the African Union. The protocol and what's expected that you can and cannot say in these settings, even based on the same set of data, will vary based on the culture of the institution. One thing that is clear is that people are not as interested in, you know, your theoretical framework or your methodology or stuff like that, but you know, I've started doing policy work because I left academia after finishing my PhD, and I worked for a think tank for a few years. And one thing is clear is, and it's probably one of the reasons why I went back to academia, is that your theoretical framework and how you understand the world definitely influences how you think and how you approach your policy work. And some people in policy will, and I think there's an increasing number of people in policy who value that. And this is the reason why you have an increasing number of scholars who are now starting to engage with the world of policy. I think it's very specific on the country where you're working and which type of agency you're dealing with. The UN and the AU are different from DOD, from formerly DFID. So be familiar. So I mean, the first step is be familiar with that particular subsection of policy world. Understand that you may need to drop there's a question about jargon, you know. That's all gone. At least for me, when I speak about my work, a lot of the academic jargon that we use needs to be completely eliminated. You're talking sometimes to people who will be focusing on a country or a conflict or a crisis for 18 months, 2 months, 1 year, and they'll be off to something else. So that also influences how much information they're willing or able to retain and how much information they already have. So there's so many variables that have to be acknowledged and accounted for when you're dealing with the world of policies. It's very, very, very broad. You know, are you given 5 minutes to give, you know, a snapshot into a presentation, or are you engaging in a brainstorming session with a diplomatic mission? So the question, I'm not sure I answered the question, but in a sense, you really have to be familiar with the type of policy organizations you're engaging with. Set aside some of the academic stuff that you've been working with, but I would argue stay true to your academic training, because in my opinion, having engaging with policymakers for quite some time, my academic training is an asset to how I understand the situation, and the disagreements that you'll have about the potential solutions are often based on your decade plus of experience in a particular context, and the local context, the national context, the regional dynamics that are involved in this issue that you're talking. So stand your ground on some of these things when necessary.
So I would, I always find myself echoing Yolande, which is to say, if you've been asked by a set of policymakers to come speak to them, it's because they think you have something to tell them, right? And they want to hear from your perspective as a social scientist. And so be true to yourself. I think, as Yolande said, though, in the presentation, and others have said this too, which is to minimize jargon, because they're not social scientists. And so if you're trying to communicate to this audience, you need to just use plain English. Actually, I think that's also often best for academic presentations as well. But I think there is a challenge, though, with being able to translate some kinds of research to this audience. So I'll give you a very concrete example. I once at the State Department, they were saying, we're gonna encourage country X to adopt this particular electoral system because we think this is really gonna help solve this kind of conflict that they're having. And I said, very plainly, I said, that's absurd, because as far as I know, there is no research showing that if you do this, if you do X, you're gonna get this other kind of result. That's not gonna do anything for this. And I could try to talk through kind of empirical examples, and I could even marshal some data, but it was a hard thing to do. And being able to present data and that in a way that's intuitive for a lay audience is difficult. And so, sometimes I find that like the easiest things to do are present crosstabs or things like that, because it's easier to explain and more intuitive. And so in fact, I spend more time thinking about the visual presentation for that kind of audience than maybe typically I do for an academic audience, because the translation part of the work is more intensive. But I think, again, going back to what we've said before, you're there to be yourself, and that's why you've been invited. And so you have to give them that perspective.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that, to what's been said already, so we can move on.
All right, we are running out of time, but I think this last question I want the panel to answer, because I think it's an important one. And it says, as a first-year PhD student, what should I make sure I am doing early in my academic career to have the skills by the end of graduate school to be prepared for giving a job talk, or perhaps even an academic talk? So what are the kinds of things that someone can do early on in their graduate career to become better? And we've mentioned some of it, but I think might be a nice sort of conclusion to our panel.
I have to run to another event, so I'm going to sign off after this, but I think teaching is a really great way to learn how to speak publicly. I think teaching is a great way to become comfortable being in front of an audience.
So I would, actually, some of the things we've talked about before can be useful here. So besides practice, I would say that leaning into the structure of the presentation itself, right? Because you have a roadmap, you know what has to happen. The next thing and the next thing that has, and so getting comfortable with the rhythm of a presentation. I will tell you, for me personally, it's usually between the first slide and the last theory slide is where I'm most nervous. But once I'm past that last theory slide, I can feel my shoulders relax, and I start to unclench, because now I know, I'm into a rhythm. And that comes, I think, differently for different folks. I think that one of the last questions I saw in Q&A was about stress and how to deal with the stress in presentations. I'm less like Yolande and more like Milli on this. I'm not a natural public speaker. It makes me very nervous. And in fact, in the first 5 minutes, I can hear my heart in my eardrums going like this. And so for me, the challenge is how to get past that so that I can focus on what I'm trying to say. But the best way, I think, especially if you're a first, second, third year graduate student still starting out, start going to conferences, also if you can, not just to watch other people, but also to present your own work. Being able to get into, especially I think Midwest tends to be a friendlier place to start, maybe in lower stakes than at APSA. I would encourage folks to, if you're an Africanist like we are on this panel, going to ASA. Those are important venues to start getting comfortable with making these kinds of public presentations. And there is no substitute for that. Because now you are talking not to a friendly audience in your own department, but you're talking to, world experts about, I still remember my very first panel as a graduate student. I can tell you who all the people were on the panel. I can't tell you what panel I was last year at ASA or APSA, but I know that very first panel because it stuck in my mind and because it was such an important moment in my own professional trajectory.
I think somebody said this earlier as well, but just in addition to everything people have said already, go to job talks, as many of them as you possibly can, because while you shouldn't necessarily, I think, try to kind of mimic other people, if it doesn't work for you, you'll very quickly learn common mistakes and you'll kind of pick up, oh, I really want to make sure if I give a talk, I'm not doing X or Y. And then you can kind of start to internalize that a little bit so that when you come to give your own job talks or academic talks, you really know what you want. It's another thing, kind of knowing what you want to be doing and then making that happen is another step, but at least you'll have a clear idea of what you want to do and don't want to do. Yeah, I mean, and I think timekeeping is really one of the crucial things. The one last thing I'll say, which isn't exactly on this question, but speaks to a couple of the other questions that I saw in the box about more about what a job talk is and what kind of audience you'll have. In the US, job talks tend to be kind of standardized, although they do vary a lot from teaching colleges to community colleges, R1s, liberal arts schools. And in Europe, the presentations are really different altogether. You might have only 10 minutes to present your research, and then you are supposed to give a kind of more overview. So just be really clear on the expectations of the department as much as you can before, get as much information as you can through formal channels, and then if you're able to, through informal channels as well, if you're able to find out more about the kind of department it is, just so that you don't, I've seen more times than you would kind of think possible, people come into a department and give a really inappropriate talk for what was expected, and it's just such a shame, because if that, and I think that's on the department, really. They should be making clear to candidates what they expect them to do, but sometimes they don't. And these norms, especially interdisciplinary, between more econ style interruption based talks versus waiting to the end for the Q&A, these misunderstandings can come up a lot. So just be as clear as, it's not like there is necessarily one standard format, although there is, I think, one that's more common than others, but make sure you know what the committee and the department expects from you in that 40 minutes or the hour and a half that you're allocated.
Absolutely. I think what Milli touches on is something that I wanted to speak on at the beginning, but it went differently. I gave a job talk in Kenya, and the structure and the expectation were completely different. So learn those and be familiar with them before you go. Otherwise, you may find yourself in trouble. And particularly for students who are of the diaspora or are international students but intend to go back home, you're trained in a particular way in North America or in Europe, and the expectation of how you translate your research where you're going back to may be different, and even within the global north, the expectations are completely different. So be aware of that. I think the last comment I want to make about how to prepare early, I think we're encouraging now a lot more than before graduate students to exchange their papers, to do peer review amongst themselves, to understand that academic writing, even if you're a solo author, is a collaborative project where people should be able to share their work with trusted scholars to get feedback, and that's useful. Sometimes we're afraid of sharing our work and then we'll just submit it. Share your written work. By the same way, you should share the way you're presenting. So find a group of people early on in your academic career who will not just listen to you, but will give you feedback the same way you would expect, or you want written feedback on how to be a better writer. Get a cohort of people, like when you go to academic conferences in your second year, I'm going to go to a panel. There's some people who will go early on in their career and they won't tell anyone because they don't want their peers to watch them. It's easier to speak in a room with people they don't know than speaking in a room with a couple of people they know. Tell your colleagues and your friends you're going to give a presentation, and don't tell them to come there for support. That's great. I want them to be there for support, but also ask them, what can I do to improve how I speak and communicate my research? If we learn to do that early on, then first it creates great bonds between your cohort or between the friends that you've picked, the community that you've built, that you probably will keep with you through your entire academic career. But it also keeps you accountable. When you tell people to just come to the talk, they always say, you did great, which is awesome. It's very supportive. But if you want to improve, tell them, I do this sometime when I speak. I do that sometime when I speak. You know, can you note where I've done it or if I've improved? To keep yourself accountable when you go speaking and when you're practicing your talks in different settings.
Great. This unfortunately concludes our panel. I think we could speak for much longer, but we are running out of time. So thank you again to all the panelists for participating and sharing your experience and your insights. That is very much appreciated. And for the audience, I just want to draw your attention again to the working group, the link that was already shared on the chat, and will be shared again with you, I think via email, if I'm not mistaken. So fill it out, and hopefully you'll have a chance to, as Yolande was already mentioning, to get together with others and share this what really is a collaborative process, where you get the chance to present, get feedback, and hopefully get better at this art. But with that, thank you everyone, and I hope this was helpful. So see you then.